Chinaza stepped into her new home with a heart full of dreams. She had just married Obina, the man she loved deeply, and believed this was the beginning of a peaceful and happy life. The family mansion was grand, filled with the scent of fresh paint and the echoes of laughter from relatives who had once lived there. She smiled politely at everyone, eager to start her new journey as a wife and daughter-in-law. But beneath the beauty of the home, an unseen tension lingered in the air. Her excitement began to fade the moment she noticed the cold stares from Obina's mother, Madame Ngozi. From the first day, it was clear that her presence wasn't welcomed. Madame Ngozi's tone was sharp, her smiles forced, and her eyes filled with silent judgment. Chinaza tried her best to ignore it. She wanted peace, not conflict. She cleaned the house, helped in the kitchen, and made sure Obina was always comfortable. Every morning, she greeted her mother-in-law with warmth, but what she got in return were harsh comments about her background and whispers that she only married for money. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere grew heavier. Nothing she did was ever enough. If she cooked, Madame Ngozi said the food lacked taste. If she cleaned, she was accused of pretending to be a perfect wife. Chinaza endured it all in silence, believing her patience would one day win her mother-in-law's heart. But instead of softening, the cruelty only grew. The breaking point came during a family event. Guests filled the living room. Laughter mixed with music, and Chinaza tried to keep a calm face. But then Madame Ngozi stood up and accused her in front of everyone of trying to take over the house. The room went silent as Chinaza's face turned pale. Her heart broke, yet she refused to let tears fall. Later, when she was ordered to leave, she walked quietly to her room. Everyone thought she would cry or beg, but instead, she opened her bag and pulled out a folded document. Her hands trembled, not with fear but strength. That day, everything changed, and no one in that mansion would ever forget what happened next. From the first morning after the wedding, Chinaza could feel the sharpness in Madame Ngozi's eyes. Her mother-in-law watched her every move, judging even the smallest gesture. When Chinaza greeted her with a warm smile and a respectful bow, Madame Ngozi only gave a cold glance and muttered under her breath, "So this is the girl who trapped my son." Those words pierced deeper than she showed. Chinaza tried to stay calm, reminding herself that patience would win her acceptance. But the more she tried, the worse it became. Every conversation with Madame Ngozi felt like walking through a field of thorns. The older woman never missed a chance to throw a cruel remark. When guests came over, she introduced Chinaza as the gold digger from nowhere. The laughter from relatives stung like fire, but Chinaza swallowed her pain and forced a smile. At meals, Madame Ngozi criticized her cooking. When Chinaza cleaned the house, she accused her of trying too hard to impress. Even when she dressed up nicely for her husband, Madame Ngozi mocked her clothes, saying she looked like someone pretending to belong. Obina often tried to defend his wife, but his mother's words always found a way to twist the truth. "You don't know women like her," she told him. "She's here for your money, not for love." Those whispers slowly poisoned the peace in the house. Chinaza could feel her husband growing distant, caught between love and loyalty to his mother. Yet she never raised her voice. She woke up early, cooked his favorite meals, and greeted everyone with kindness, even when her heart ached. Days turned into weeks, and the walls of the mansion began to feel like a prison. No matter what she did, her mother-in-law's dislike only deepened. The servants started to follow Madame Ngozi's example, treating Chinaza with silent disrespect. She often hid in her room at night, whispering silent prayers for strength, wondering if love was worth this much pain. Still, she refused to give up. Somewhere deep inside, she believed that one day, truth would speak louder than insults, and the same people who mocked her would come to see her real worth. Every morning, Chinaza woke up before sunrise, determined to make her marriage work. She swept the mansion floors, prepared breakfast for everyone, and made sure the table was set before her husband came downstairs. She hoped her efforts would bring peace, but each day began with criticism. Madame Ngozi would sit at the dining table, frowning at every little thing. If the tea was too hot, she complained. If it was warm, she said Chinaza was lazy. Nothing ever pleased her. Chinaza tried harder with every passing day. She cooked new dishes, cleaned every corner of the house, and smiled even when her hands ached. But instead of appreciation, she received cold stares and cruel comments. Madame Ngozi told the relatives that her son's wife was pretending to be good, so she could take control of the family. Even the housemaids started to treat Chinaza with disrespect, copying the mother-in-law's behavior. It felt like everyone had joined hands to break her spirit. One afternoon, after hours of cooking, she proudly served a special meal she learned from her late mother. She hoped it would soften Madame Ngozi's heart, but as soon as the first bite was taken, the older woman slammed her spoon on the table. "This food is tasteless," she shouted. "You can't even cook properly. What did my son ever see in you?" The laughter from some relatives filled the room, and Chinaza's heart sank. She wanted to cry, but she simply bowed her head and said softly, "I'll do better next time." Even Obinna began to grow quiet. He no longer defended her as he once did. His silence hurt more than the insults. Every night, Chinaza lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how her love story had turned into endless humiliation. Yet deep inside she refused to break. Her heart whispered that storms don't last forever. She decided to keep her dignity, no matter how much they tried to crush it. Each insult became fuel for her strength. She started to smile again, not for them, but for herself. They thought their words made her weak, but they were unknowingly shaping the woman who would soon shock them all. The house was full that evening, laughter and music echoing through the grand hall. Relatives had gathered for a family celebration, and Chinaza moved from one guest to another, serving drinks and food with a gentle smile. She hoped that maybe, just maybe, this day would pass peacefully. But Madame Ngozi's sharp eyes followed her every move, waiting for a chance to strike. Chinaza could sense the tension but kept her head high, pretending everything was fine. As everyone sat around the dining table, the conversation turned to the mansion and its future. That was when Madame Ngozi suddenly stood up, her voice cutting through the laughter. "Some women think marrying my son gives them the right to claim what they didn't work for," she said coldly. The room went silent. Everyone's eyes turned toward Chinaza. Her heart pounded as she tried to understand what was happening. Then Madame Ngozi pointed directly at her and said loudly, "You think I don't know your plan? You're trying to steal my son's house." Gasps filled the room. Chinaza froze, unable to speak. She looked at Obinna, hoping he would defend her, but he sat quietly, his face pale with shock. The humiliation was unbearable. Relatives whispered, some hiding smiles, others staring with pity. Madame Ngozi continued, saying Chinaza had been acting too comfortable, too confident, as if she owned the place. Each word was like a knife to Chinaza's heart. For a moment, it felt like the ground beneath her feet disappeared. She wanted to run away, but something stronger held her still, her pride. She didn't shout back or argue. Instead, she stood calmly, her eyes glistening but steady. Everyone waited for her to break down, but she simply took a deep breath and said softly, "I have never stolen anything in my life." Her voice was calm, yet powerful enough to silence even her harshest critics. After that night, the air in the mansion grew heavier. The laughter from that gathering turned into gossip. Chinaza became the subject of every whisper, the woman accused of wanting what wasn't hers. But little did they know, she held a truth that would soon turn their cruel words into deep regret, a truth that would change everything. The tension in the mansion reached its peak that night. Madame Ngozi's anger had been boiling for days, and now she finally exploded in front of everyone. The relatives had gathered in the living room, still whispering about the last family incident, when Madame Ngozi suddenly stood up and shouted so loudly that the room fell silent. Her face was red with rage, and her voice shook the walls as she pointed at Chinaza. "Pack your things and get out of my son's house today," she screamed. The words cut through the air like thunder. Everyone gasped. Chinaza stood frozen, her hands trembling as all eyes turned to her. She could feel her heart breaking, but she didn't say a word. Obinna looked torn but said nothing. The silence from her husband hurt more than his mother's shouting. Madame Ngozi continued, calling her names, accusing her of being ungrateful and deceitful. "You came here to take what doesn't belong to you," she yelled. "You will leave this house before the sun sets." Some relatives tried to calm her down, but she refused to listen. The servants stood at a distance, whispering among themselves, enjoying the drama. Chinaza could feel tears pushing against her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her heart was heavy, yet her face remained calm. She looked around the room at the people who had watched her work hard every day without complaint, and yet, not one person spoke in her defense. Slowly, she turned toward the stairs, her voice quiet but steady. If this is what you want, I will go, she said. There was no anger in her tone, just a quiet dignity that left everyone speechless. Madame Ngozi scoffed and folded her arms, thinking she had won. The family whispered in disbelief as Chinaza walked away, her steps graceful even in pain. In her room, she packed her few belongings into a small bag, but instead of crying, she sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, taking a deep breath. There was something in her eyes, strength, not sorrow. She opened her bag and looked at a folded document she had kept hidden for weeks. That single piece of paper would soon turn her humiliation into victory, and no one in that house was ready for what was about to come. Chinaza walked slowly toward her room, her steps unsteady and her heart heavy. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt cold and strange. Every whisper behind her back felt like a knife. The woman who had entered this home with dreams was now being sent away like a stranger. Her hands trembled, but she kept her head high. She didn't look back at anyone. The sound of Madame Ngozi's angry voice still echoed in her ears, yet Chinaza didn't let it break her spirit. When she reached her room, she closed the door gently and stood there in silence, letting the weight of everything sink in. For a moment, she thought about crying, about letting out the pain that had built up inside her for weeks. But she stopped herself. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked around the room that had witnessed all her struggles. The bed she had shared with Obinna, the clothes she had neatly folded, and the framed photo from their wedding. All of it seemed distant now. Then slowly, she walked to the small drawer near her bed, opened it, and pulled out a brown envelope she had kept hidden. Her fingers brushed over the folded document inside. It was more than just paper. It was the truth she had been keeping quietly, waiting for the right moment. As she opened it, her eyes softened, not with sadness, but with calm determination. That piece of paper carried her husband's signature, the one that declared ownership of the mansion. And the name written on it was hers. She smiled faintly, not out of pride, but out of peace. She didn't want revenge. She only wanted respect, the one thing she had never received in this house. She folded the paper back neatly and placed it inside her bag. Her tears had dried. Her heart was still. Outside the room, she could hear people talking, some mocking, others curious. But Chinaza knew that in just a few minutes, everything would change. She fixed her scarf, picked up her small bag, and stepped out quietly. Her walk was calm, but every step carried power. They thought they had broken her, but they had only given her the perfect moment to reveal the truth that would silence them all forever. Chinaza walked out of her room holding her small bag, her face calm but her heart racing. Everyone in the living room stared at her as she made her way toward the door. Madame Ngozi stood proudly with her arms crossed, ready to see her out. "Good riddance," she muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Chinaza didn't reply. She just kept walking quietly toward the gate. But just as she reached the main door, the sound of a car stopping outside caught everyone's attention. Two men in dark suits stepped out, holding briefcases and official papers. Their presence immediately changed the air in the house. The older of the two greeted respectfully, asking, "Good afternoon, please. Is this the Okeke residence?" Madame Ngozi stepped forward, her tone full of pride. "Yes, this is my son's house. Can I help you?" she said. The men exchanged a quick look, then one of them replied politely, "We are here from the property registration office. We came to finalize the ownership transfer for Mrs. Chinaza Okeke." The entire room fell silent. For a moment no one moved. Madame Ngozi blinked, unsure she heard correctly. "For who?" she asked sharply. The official repeated calmly, "For Mrs. Chinaza Okeke. We were instructed to deliver the final documents and confirm the legal ownership of this property in her name." All eyes turned to Chinaza, who was still standing by the door, her bag in one hand, her expression composed. Whispers filled the room as confusion spread. Obinna stood up suddenly, his face pale. "What are you saying?" he asked. The official opened his folder and handed over a copy of the signed documents. These were filed and approved by Mr. Obinna Okeke. As of last week, this property legally belongs to his wife. The words hit everyone like a storm. Madame Ngozi's mouth fell open, her proud smile vanishing. She stared at Chinaza as if she had seen a ghost. Chinaza didn't gloat or speak. She simply looked at them with quiet grace. The same woman they had called weak now stood as the rightful owner of the mansion. Without shouting or anger, She had turned the moment of her humiliation into one of powerful truth. One of the officials opened the file he carried and pulled out a stamped document. The paper was crisp, the ink still fresh, and the room was so quiet that even the sound of pages turning echoed. Everyone's eyes were on him as he began to read in a firm, clear voice. By legal documents signed by Mr. Obinna Okeke, this property is solely owned by Mrs. Chinaza Okeke. The moment those words left his mouth, a wave of shock swept through the room. It was as if time froze. Madame Ngozi's proud expression disappeared instantly. Her hands trembled as she tried to process what she had just heard. "That's impossible," she shouted, her voice cracking. "This house belongs to my son." But the official remained calm and handed her a copy of the document. "Ma'am, this is the registered deed. It bears the signature of Mr. Obinna Okeke and the seal of the Land Registry Office. All ownership rights now belong to his wife." Obinna stood speechless, unable to look his mother in the eye. He remembered the day he signed those papers. He had wanted to surprise Chinaza, to make her feel secure in their marriage, but he never imagined this moment would come so soon. Chinaza stood silently, her hands clasped in front of her, her face calm but strong. She didn't look triumphant. She looked free. The relatives began whispering in disbelief. Some avoided Madame Ngozi's eyes. Others looked at Chinaza with new respect. The same woman who had been insulted moments ago now stood as the true owner of the mansion. The tension was thick, and the silence was louder than any shout. Madame Ngozi's legs gave way, and she sank slowly into a chair, her pride shattered. Chinaza finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I never came here to take anything. I only wanted love and peace." But maybe this was the only way to be heard. Her words carried grace, not revenge. She turned toward the officials and thanked them politely. Then, with quiet dignity, she picked up her bag and walked out of the house, leaving everyone frozen, staring after her, realizing that the woman they once mocked now held all the power. The moment the official finished reading the document, silence filled the mansion. It was the kind of silence that made every breath sound loud. Everyone froze in place, too stunned to move or speak. The laughter and gossip that once filled the room vanished in an instant. All eyes turned to Chinaza, the same woman they had mocked, now standing tall and calm. Madame Ngozi's face lost all color. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The reality of what she had just heard hit her like lightning. The house she proudly called her son's no longer belonged to him. It now legally belonged to the daughter-in-law she had insulted and humiliated. Her voice trembled as she tried to speak. "No, this can't be true," she whispered, shaking her head. But the official quietly handed her the file again, pointing at the signatures and seals that proved everything. She looked down at the paper with wide eyes, hoping it was some kind of mistake. But it wasn't. Her son's name was there, written clearly beside Chinaza's. Tears of disbelief welled up in her eyes. The relatives stood awkwardly, whispering among themselves. Some tried to hide their shock. Others just stared at Chinaza in awe. Even Obinna couldn't meet his wife's eyes. He had stayed silent when his mother insulted her, and now guilt weighed heavily on him. Chinaza looked around the room, her expression calm, almost peaceful. She didn't shout or gloat. She simply stood there with quiet strength, the truth finally standing on her side. Madame Ngozi covered her face with her hands, her pride collapsing. "I didn't know," she murmured, but the words were too late. The same woman she had called a gold digger was now the legal owner of everything she once claimed to protect. Chinaza slowly stepped forward and said softly, "I never wanted to take anything from anyone. I just wanted to be treated with respect." Her gentle tone made everyone lower their heads. Without another word, she picked up her bag and walked toward the door. The sound of her heels on the marble floor was the only thing that broke the silence. No one dared to stop her. That quiet walk out of the mansion became the most powerful moment of all. Madame Ngozi sat quietly on the couch, her eyes still filled with shame and disbelief. The proud woman who once shouted and commanded now looked small and broken. Chinaza walked slowly back into the room, her steps light but confident. Everyone turned as she approached her mother-in-law. There was no anger in her face, only calm strength. She looked at the woman who had called her names, insulted her, and thrown her out, and instead of bitterness, she smiled softly. The family watched in silence, waiting to see what she would do. Chinaza stopped right in front of Madame Ngozi and said gently, "Mama, I forgive you." The room went still again. Madame Ngozi lifted her head in shock, her lips trembling as tears filled her eyes. "After all I did to you," she whispered. Chinaza nodded and replied, "Respect isn't demanded, it's earned. I don't hate you, Mama. I just want peace." Her words were soft, but carried more power than any shout could. Everyone felt it. The grace in her heart, the strength in her silence. Madame Ngozi began to cry openly, realizing how deeply she had wronged her. She reached out and held Chinaza's hand, something she had never done before. "I'm sorry," she said through her tears. Chinaza simply nodded, then turned to the rest of the family, her expression gentle yet firm. "I'll be leaving soon," she said. "This house isn't my home anymore. I'll build my own, not just with bricks but with peace and respect." Her words touched everyone in the room. Even Obinna, who had stayed silent for too long, looked down in regret. Chinaza picked up her bag and walked to the door, her white dress swaying softly as she stepped into the sunlight. She didn't look back, because she didn't need to. She had won not by revenge, but by grace. The same woman they once tried to break had left them speechless, stronger, wiser, and free. Bustias. Thank you so much for watching to the end. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.